Hey, so y'all heard the story this week that Trump claims that he met with the president of the Virgin Islands this week?
That's you dipshit.
Hey guys, welcome to this episode of Trending Left. I'm Andrew Herrera.
I'm Samuel Birdsall.
I'm Marco Guajardo.
And I'm Nicholas Cobb.
Alright, so we're going to go ahead and get into the slew of tabloid-style news stories we have for you guys this week. When I was going back and looking at everything that we wanted to talk about, I was just astounded about how much had happened this week. And it doesn't even feel like 7 days anymore, from show to show.
No.
Just the amount of crap.
Everything is getting so non-linear.
The things that happen the Monday after the show, like I end up forgetting they even happened
Exactly.
when we record the next
Yes.
show. It's ridiculous.
Me too.
And to start off on all of this, we have what's being called the most expensive publicity stunt in history. Mike Pence was ordered by Trump to leave an NFL football game early because they knew that the players were going to kneel for the national anthem. How do you guys feel about that?
Oh my god. I mean, frankly, Pence has always been one of those people who likes to grandstand and just that he would use taxpayer money to, support such a pointless gesture and something that's really, frankly, completely against our First Amendment rights. Like, we all have the freedom of speech. The NFL players have union rights that say that they can do these kind of things to try to help affect other. Wow, I'm gonna call it.
Yeah, it's just a weak political stunt overall, really.
Yeah, look, throughout all of this, it's important to remember the juxtaposition of when conservatives decry liberals that, we want to fight intolerance and fight, how things are being talked about, quote-unquote political correctness. They say, well, liberals are snowflakes, they need to man up and, learn that this is the real world and learn how to take a message and grow a spine. I mean, this is Mike Pence leaving a football game, presumably like he was there to watch the football game, but he left because he did not like, the politically incorrect protest that the football players were doing. It's absolutely hypocritical, and it kind of shows who the real snowflakes are.
I mean, just the idea that Trump called Pence into the White House one day and was like, Mike, I get the best job for you. God. And just ordered him to go cross country, to this football game, and he's like, "You're gonna be there for 5 minutes." And Mike Pence is like, "I'm not even there for the first quarter."
We have become the poor man's SNL.
It's just ridiculous. I mean, I think that the idea of this stunt is actually pretty powerful. I just think it's kind of diminished for them because all these details came out that he was ordered to do it. Yeah. So it kind of just seems like Trump's lapdog.
There's no moral outrage.
Yeah, it's what it's planned.
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
So the next story we have for you guys is equally just flabbergasting. Trump was defending his throwing of paper towels at hurricane survivors in Puerto Rico, and this is a direct quote from him. He said this to Mike Huckabee during an interview. Mm-hmm. They had these beautiful, soft towels, very good towels.
Well, I feel like that's a metaphor for how Trump is treating Puerto Rico. He's just throwing nonsense at them. Like how you see from his tweets, like, oh, Puerto Rico always wants this, always want this. It's just ludicrous.
I think Trump has never seen a paper towel in his life, and that's why
he was astounded.
Yeah. He's like, wow, I didn't know towels could be this slim, but this soft also. Because let's be honest, Trump has probably used actual towels and just throwing them away after using them just once.
I think he thinks a lot of it is like a publicity stunt, where he's giving out something to these people, and they have to be grateful to the United States and therefore him. We saw videos of him after the Hurricane Harvey stuff, where he's loading up one, pallet or one of those little boxes with the plastic wrap on top of water bottles into the back of a truck and being like, "Good job, everyone." Okay, yeah, it's a symbolic thing. It's for a nice picture and things like that. But I mean, it's just at the end of the day, it's just him parading around, being like, "Aren't you guys glad I'm here? Aren't you happy?"
And also, is the disaster area over? Are we done? Can I go home now? Can y'all be better off now? This is a multi-year effort that it's going to take to not just rehabilitate Houston and parts of Louisiana. Puerto Rico is still U.S. territory, and it's going to take longer to rehabilitate that area because it's it's harder to get supplies to and from. It's a lower developed region of the country. It's often forgotten. It's
And all the debt, right?
Yeah, it's in Puerto Rico's debt, and it's very easy for Congress to forget to appropriate funds or to expend those to expel those funds because it's just an area that's not often talked about.
In general, because he's not a politician, he doesn't have an idea of the time horizons of legislative priorities and things like that. He doesn't understand that it takes time to get things done.
Of course.
And often that sucks in politics, but it's just a reality of living in a democracy.
Yeah.
You have dissent, you have veto players in a democracy. He just thinks that everything should be able, like whenever he was in business, to just be signed away, and then someone like a contractor takes care of it. But that's not how it goes in politics. You have to work with people, you have to get things done. And in relief efforts and things like this, obviously they should be non-political, but there's still a lot of people who will deny you funding for something, like we're seeing with the Hurricane Harvey stuff, because they were denied funding for Hurricane Sandy.
Right.
So there's a lot of politics that interplays with that, and he's like, why can't we just fix this right away? Well, because one, the United States has mistreated these places for a long time, and because of a lack of infrastructure investment from us, it's going to take even longer now to rebuild. So I just think it shows an ignorance once again on his part, along with the Virgin Islands thing, along with all this stuff. Like, he doesn't understand the history between the United States and these territories. He just doesn't know because he hasn't taken the time to learn it. He didn't know it before running for office. It's just ignorance. Cool. So we have the Harvey Weinstein stuff that has recently come out. All of
goodness
these.
gracious.
I don't want to say the allegations because obviously they have proof. They've come out with recordings and stuff that they've caught on sting operations. How do you guys feel that this kind of reflects just like general misogyny and like sexual objectification in the media?
See, I feel like it's disappointing because I've seen videos and stuff. They've been making jokes about Harvey Weinstein, perhaps or definitely being someone who does sexual assault for like years and years. Like there's old clips everywhere, and parodies and stuff. So it's kind of a shame that that consistently you see in Hollywood and just everywhere in general that people who are being sexually assaulted aren't getting justice, and if they do, it takes years and years and years. Like you saw that with Bill Cosby. Like the allegations were big in 2005, and I think I remember even seeing that, but it totally went away, faded into the ether until Hannibal Buress brought it up in his comedy sketches again, and then people were like, "Yeah, whatever happened to that?" So it's just a shame that this happens so often with sexual assault cases.
Well, Cosby didn't even get convicted, right?
No, he didn't.
Yeah. Even when these allegations and massive amounts of proof come out, they're still not taken seriously. They're constantly victim blamed, and it's exceptionally difficult for women to receive justice in the first place, even when the preponderance of evidence is on their side.
So Democrats have been quick to disavow Weinstein and to say, this money that I have, I'm going to give it back. I'm going to donate it to other charities. I'm not going to take money from this guy or his conglomerate or whatever businesses he's associated with, and that's good, right? Like that's exactly the response we want from Democrats because let's face it, the Democratic Party receives a lot of donations and a lot of money from Hollywood and Hollywood elites, which depending on your stance, it's fine or it's not fine, but like it's we have to recognize that that's an industry that disproportionately supports Democrats, and we have to hold them accountable, right? We have to hold them accountable like Republicans don't hold people like Trump accountable or Roger Ailes accountable. And I think that the response from Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, I read an article today that said that she received something like $10,000 from Harvey Weinstein. She's going to donate that to a women's charity, which is great, right? She's not going to keep that money because it's tainted money. Obviously, we cannot forget the language of rape culture, words like alleged and claimed and whatnot are just used to discredit potential victims. So it's important to remember that as we read the news, and it's good that he's being disavowed and just sort of disconnected from Hollywood culture.
So the next article, Trump thinks he invented the word fake.
Oh my God!
I actually think, and maybe this is just me not having read like a ton of the story on this because I don't think there really is that much of a story, to be honest. I think it's just tabloid, MSNBC like clickbait stuff. I think he was actually like trying to, in his third grader vocabulary, say that like he invented the term fake news, which
which is also not true.
Yeah, right, I don't know. It's just ridiculous.
No, fake news has been around since before Trump, and like the terminology has been around. He obviously gravitated toward it because it was a very hot and buzzwordy.
It's a very
buzzwordy term, but he used that to, basically any media that he doesn't like is fake news. That's your CNNs and WAPOs and NYTs.
Something I wanted to draw into this as far as like First Amendment stuff, the press. I don't know exactly who it is, but I saw an article saying a Republican legislator has issued a bill right now that is going to require that that members of the press will have to like contract themselves through police departments and provide fingerprints and stuff like that. And his justification was, well, if you're going to regulate my Second Amendment right, I'm going to regulate your First Amendment right.
What?
Which is ridiculous.
Yeah. Here's the difference. Freedom of speech doesn't instantly kill people.
It doesn't kill people. Yeah,
That's the difference.
Yeah, and that's just more instances of the Trump administration just really suppressing the press. Like you saw for a while that they weren't doing videos of these of the White House press secretary and the news people, and then they banned some people from, was it the New York Times and who else?
CNN.
Yeah, CNN. Yeah.
Right.
So and, clearly Trump
and they give
is acting like an enemy of the press right now.
InfoWars, it's Breitbart, and groups like that. I mean, it's ridiculous.
This is also just a problem with the Republican Party in general. Earlier, mid last year, we saw that people like Paul Ryan and his ilk were shutting down C-SPAN because they didn't like that House Democrats were staging that sit-in for gun control, and they were, C-SPAN has a right to be there. C-SPAN has a right to, record the proceedings of Congress. It's important for the American people to be able to see that sort of thing, and it was a major moment, it was a major event, and Republicans are shutting down, they're just shutting down freedom of speech.
Okay, so with Trump using language like the press being the enemy of the people, that harkens back to the era of, say, Nazi Germany. That was one of the ways they attacked the press to try to consolidate it and bring it under their control. That kind of rhetoric is a direct indication of approaching authoritarianism.
Exactly.
And if something isn't done about it, and if Republicans don't stand up to it, then we could face even more trying times as a nation, to put it lightly.
I really wouldn't call it approaching authoritarianism. I think Trump is an authoritarian. I'm not fully at the level of wanting to call him a fascist yet. I think he's getting close to that too. But I mean, wanting to shut down the press, advocating to have military personnel and vehicles marching through the streets like they do on Bastille Day in France, saying that we need to be a strong country again by advocating only for American interest. That's nationalism. I think that he's at authoritarianism right now. If he goes any further, we're going to see something very scary that I don't think we've ever seen before. So next one, yet another mind-boggling story. In an interview, Trump says that he has a higher IQ than Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and this is in response to Rex Tillerson having reportedly having called Trump a effing moron. So, I mean, this paired
not untrue words, Rex Tillerson. Not untrue.
This paired with another story that came out on Wednesday, and the tagline is "White House in crisis?" ? Trump is reported having said to his previous security, the head of his security detail, who was also the head of his security detail in the private sector, and he kind of carried over to the White House. He doesn't work there anymore. He's reported having said to this man, "I hate everyone in the White House."
Yeah, I feel that.
So
I do too. Don't worry about it.
We've seen the infighting get to the point where people, Priebus are out, Bannon is out. How do you guys feel like the state of the White House is right now as far as the infighting goes? We're not seeing as much about a lot of people like Kushner anymore. We're seeing a lot of stories still coming up about Manafort and people like that are already out of the White House. But it seems like, at least outwardly, it's kind of calmed down a little bit. Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, there aren't, as major firings as there were just a couple months ago when, Scaramucci was out, Spicer was out, Priebus was out, people like John Kelly were in, Sarah Huckabee Sanders were in, we are at a point where I'm not sure, and Sebastian Gorka is also out as well, that was I think last month. We're at a point where I think we can confidently say that the wings vying for power in the White House, right now it's the more establishment, quote unquote, moderate Republican, wing is kind of in control, but that can sway violently at Trump's whim. He has the power to fire and hire anyone really who he wants, because none of these are Senate confirmable, obviously. And when it comes to his cabinet, we haven't had any major firings, if I recall correctly. Maybe
Price.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, no, that's right. No, that's right.
I'm like Price.
That was last week. Totally forgot about that. I'm sorry. Totally forgot about that. It's been a week, all right? But until we start seeing Rex Tillerson out, people like Scott Pruitt out for whatever reason, Stephen Mnuchin, I don't know that we can call the White House in disarray because internally, like the staff has just been a bit more constant lately. But I think like the talk right now really has been Trump versus his cabinet versus Trump versus his staff.
And I think a lot of it is him playing with legislators too. We saw Bob Corker and him kind of have a Twitter beef. That's not the first time. He's attacked Bob Corker 4 times now.
Corker uncorked.
4 times now on Twitter. I think it's just what a lot of aides have come out, saying, people who are close to the president, that he's unhinged, that at times like he just violently swings into moods. He gets petulant anytime he hears any sort of bad press. They've come out with stories saying that they have to give him like positive news in the mornings. Like it is someone's job to find articles that praise Trump and like present him with it, like with his morning.
Yeah, his cabinet meetings are like that. His cabinet meetings are nothing but like him like stroking his ego.
Yeah,
so maybe the White House isn't like in shambles, but I think we can definitely say that it's in disarray, that it's an unhealthy administration, and I think it's been that way from the get-go. But I think we're seeing it calm down outwardly, but I'm still worried because we still have figures like Stephen Miller, who have nationalist views on the inside. We don't know who's possibly going to be appointed next. I mean, he could bring on Kid Rock as his special advisor for foreign affairs or something like that.
Oh, God.
For all we know. It's so hard to say at this point because Trump is so unpredictable. And I don't know if we're going to get a better outcome if someone like Mnuchin is fired, if someone like Pruitt is fired. I think we'll just get the same old person.
Probably worse.
Pretty much, or probably worse readmitted, So it's, at this point, I think it's resisting those white nationalist archetypes within the White House, and that's the most important thing.
I feel like if those people got fired, at least the replacements wouldn't be as corporatist, though.
Nah, I think they would still.
No, they'd be corporatist.
There's a reason that those
Trump
people.
Administration, let's be honest.
There's a reason that those people were appointed in the first place, and it's because a lot of them gave money to his campaign or his friends who wanted tax cuts. And I think that he's just going to find another. He always talks about how he knows so many people. He knows so many good guys, so many friends. He's just going to find them all over again. All right. So the next story we have Trump recently signed an executive order on healthcare. Overhauling a lot of the Obamacare marketplace. We have a lot of states that have sued in response to this executive order, stating that Trump, and also the subsequent announcement that he's going to be cutting a lot of the Obamacare subsidies to help out low-income families and low-income insurees. We've had a lot of, I think it's 16 states maybe?
19, I want to say.
19, okay.
Yeah.
That have sued him in response to this. How do you guys feel like about this right off the get-go? I mean, just the idea of dismantling the Obama legacy and cutting healthcare and yet saying you're making it better?
Yeah, so Trump, before he went to office, loved to say Obamacare is broken, Obamacare, is about to explode, implode, insert destructive metaphor here. And the fact of the matter is, while Obamacare has its faults and many counties in the country are still with just one provider, it used to be the case that there were counties without any providers. I don't think it's the case anymore. But Obamacare has been, fairly stable, and fixes would have been enacted if we had elected Hillary Clinton into office. But Trump undermining Obamacare is not the same as, Trump accusing Obamacare of being faulty, because it would not have been faulty otherwise. So if Trump wants to go out there on the stump and say Obamacare is imploding, is failing, that's because you are making it worse. And if people are dying, it's because you created exceptions for people with pre-existing conditions, where now certain certain health insurance contracts no longer are required by law to cover, or to not be discriminatory towards people with pre-existing conditions. So that's your fault.
Well, and we know he wants it to fail because they've cut massively the budget that went towards funding advertisements for Obamacare.
Right.
They don't want people on it. They don't want it to succeed. They don't want it to seem like it's working, because then people won't vote, in favor of people who want to keep the system, essentially.
Exactly. Essentially, it just goes back to this sort of newer Republican mindset of just forget about doing anything good, just go against Obama.
Yep.
Plain and simple.
So something I made a Facebook post on the day of, because I was really interested and I wanted to hear people's thoughts on this question. I think this is going to be at least brought up in the courts as unconstitutional. And the reason is because Congress is given the power to regulate healthcare, nationwide or for marketplaces because of the Commerce Clause.
Right.
But you have a president who, through an executive order, I feel is overriding Congress's authority by establishing markets across state lines. So I was really interested in that, because this, exactly what they're doing, like letting people establish basically like collectives where they combine together to form risk pool type things. That's Rand Paul's idea. He literally wrote a bill about this. He wrote a bill about, what Trump was calling during the debates, the lines around the states, right? Making it easier for people to buy insurance. this is literally just Rand Paul's bill. That's why he was there, standing behind Trump. I don't know if
Yeah,
you guys...
and Rand Paul's been with Trump on like certain trips within the country this week as well.
And so that's why I'm wondering if there were members of the party, maybe including Rand Paul, who said, oh yeah, we're going to do this the right way, the constitutional way, and put a bill forward. The bill gains no traction because, frankly,
And
it's an awful bill.
Yeah.
And then they say, well, screw it. We'll just have Trump, sign it into law. He's done that with every other major thing that we've done in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if the reason that they proposed it as a bill first and then did this is because it failed, and they just decided, well, screw legality. We'll just do it unconstitutionally.
Yep. Again, last person in the room has Trump's sway and Trump's legislative authority. If we were cautiously optimistic that the Democrats would be able to go in there and sweet talk him, not for longer than 2 or 3 days.
I'm also interested in what he's giving Congress in response to this, because it wasn't a very popular bill. Obviously, the idea of it is kind of popular, as far as the across state lines is free market out the wazoo.
Yeah.
But the whole risk pool thing is something that I don't think that McConnell really supported. So I'm really interested in seeing going forward from here, what did Trump give them in response to them not completely decrying the fact that he's signing this order, if that makes sense.
Yeah, highly doubt it. Trump has blindsided, Senate and House Republicans in the past. I don't see how it is more likely that Trump called Mitch McConnell, called Paul Ryan, and said, look, I'm going to pass this thing, here's your heads up, and, you guys have to give me something, or I'll give you something, or whatever. I doubt that's the case.
To be fair, it'd be really bad optics for the Republican Party to be like, oh man, how dare you do something that messes up Obamacare after they've been screaming bloody murder at it.
Yeah. I mean,
but it also depends which Republican senator you are. If you're Susan Collins or you're Lisa Murkowski, then you will say, wait, this isn't helping Obamacare, because people like Collins and Murkowski, they don't love Obamacare, but they realize that it's the system that is in place, and if you're gonna improve it / eliminate it, then you have to do it the right way, or do it in a more bipartisan way, quote unquote. So if you're a Republican, if you're a sitting Republican senator, then yeah, maybe you would decry that sort of thing.
So, all right, well, that's plenty on healthcare, I think.
Yeah.
Next story. You guys saw Eminem's
yeah,
his freestyle rap about Trump. How do you guys feel about that, as far as freedom of expression and stuff like that?
I mean, I actually didn't see it, but I love Eminem. I've always, for example, his raps against Bush. I think there was Mosh, for example.
Yeah.
I've always been really appreciative of his willing to use his celebrity status, and I have a true appreciation of his lyrical ability. Unlike Kanye, he is actually a lyrical genius.
Whoa! Okay. This is not a music discussion podcast, but if you think Kanye doesn't have lyrical ability, I think you and I need to step outside and have a little chat. Okay?
I'm not saying he doesn't have ability. I'm just saying he doesn't have genius.
Moving on. So I want hot takes from everybody on the floor right now.
Yes.
Eminem versus Kid Rock in the Michigan Senate race. Are we okay with this or not okay with this?
God, no.
Yeah, that's what I've been hearing. No, but on a more serious note, Eminem is a guy with a fan base that is not, mostly these kinds of people, but there's a significant amount of them are the people that, I hate rap, but I love Eminem, right? You hate rap because you hate black people. Okay, let's just let's not mince words here. Okay, so for Eminem to come out and disavow his racist fans or people that are his fans and also fans of Trump, and he's saying, "Get away from me! I don't want you to be my fan." That's a swing in the right direction. It's always been clear to me that Eminem is, I don't call him a progressive guy, but he's always been anti-Republican. And as of late, been advocating for more social causes, social justice causes, and for him to come out and do this sort of thing, it's good, right? Obviously, it doesn't excuse some of his very, very foul homophobic language in the past, but we can look at this and say, we can always acknowledge when people have changed, and it's pretty clear that he has changed a lot and has matured a lot. I mean, he is a 45-year-old guy now, so for him to come out and do this, use his star power, as Sam said, to advance a rightful political message, that's good. That's good in my view.
And last story for the pod this week, we have the Iran deal stuff that's going on right now. Mm-hmm. Trump's been criticizing it heavily. Tillerson has differed with him and said that he wants us to stay in, that its net benefits are positive. Have you guys heard any coverage about this?
Yeah.
You want to talk about it?
Well, I guess Tillerson has the higher IQ then.
I think we could guess that right off the bat, okay? He did go to the University of Texas at Austin.
Oh, man. I have such pride right now.
Sam is actually wearing his UT hat and UT shirt and matching orange shoes, so he does, yeah. But do you want to talk about what you were reading, Sam?
So there's an interesting disparity between how Trump handled the Iran deal, where he kicked it to Congress, and what he did with the other major policy implementation with healthcare, where on one hand he was like, oh, I'm going to do this all on my own, and then with the Iran deal, he basically just kicked it to Congress.
I mean, because he doesn't have, it's a bilateral treaty, so he doesn't have the authority by himself to override it. Congress has authority there as well. And so we've seen like the EU representatives come out and say like the U.S. is not going to withdraw from this. I don't care what they're saying.
Right.
It's too important. You can't do it.
I think there are legal
it's
boundaries
a UN,
that prevent them
it's a
from
UN
withdrawing.
resolution. Like
Yeah,
it's not something that it was just us and Iran. It was us and the entire Security Council.
Yeah, and it's becoming like just increasingly.
Trump doesn't understand that. He thinks that everything's like a real estate deal where you just like, like, oh, we signed a contract, but I'll just get my lawyer on it. No,
Right.
that's not how it works.
It's also becoming like increasingly clear that like Iran hasn't done anything heinous since
No,
the passing
they
of the
haven't.
deal. Like it's every month that like, or I think the checks for like their nuclear capabilities are like quarterly. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Don't quote me on this, but like they're pretty frequent. Like UN checkers and like US checkers, like, and it's clear like the stories come out and like they don't get a lot of traction because it's not a very sexy news story, but like it's clear that like Iran isn't following the rules.
It has definitely statistically decreased the likelihood of any sort of nuclear risk in Iran. And I mean that we're seeing that just based on like the fact that we don't get coverage on it anymore. Iran and Iraq used to be like the biggest enemies of the US as far as the media was concerned. They're always portraying them as like, awful, bad, this is a disaster, but now we don't see anything.
And there's also the factor that if we end up changing any of our terms of the deal, then that makes us look like the ones who broke the deal, because you can't just add on to it once it's already an established treaty. It's really, U.S. credibility is already effectively decimated already, but this will just, nobody's going to trust the U.S. to follow through on its commitments again ever at this rate.
Right, like this is also the start, or like one of the starts of like the Trump-Corker feud. Corker being on, I think, a foreign intelligence or like a foreign affairs committee, like he has a vested interest in like making sure that the U.S. is still seen favorably abroad, as favorably as it possibly can be now, and like has a vested interest in making sure that like Iran isn't doing anything suspicious or that like things are flowing in the right direction. So like, which is kind of like where we see Corker saying, is there, is the adult daycare working at the White House still?
Yeah.
So like I was listening to this podcast. It was really interesting because it was not trending left. Stop. I listened to other podcasts, all right? And they were saying that, like, Corker and, like, Republican leadership and Democratic leadership, really, like, they are the last, like, defense for, like, foreign affairs, like, our foreign allies and, our enemies, too, like, to say, like, are there competent people working in Washington right now? So if you have people like Corker standing up and saying, hey, stop undermining the Iran deal, you are an adult baby, basically, like that gives us a little bit of, added quote-unquote star power on the world stage. Obviously, foreign policy is dictated by the president, but if we can help to, undermine the president and his statements by saying, well, you can't do this, you can't do that, you are in the wrong here, well, that's the best we can possibly get out of this awful administration.
All right, guys, so that's pretty much it for all the stories we have for you. We will see you guys back in just a second with our special guest.
Yeah. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. In the studio with us today, we have Saurabh Sharma. He is an officer with the UT branch of Young Conservatives of Texas, and he's going to come talk to us about gerrymandering. Saurabh, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you guys for having me on. Like Marco said, I'm an officer in the Young Conservatives of Texas. When he reached out to me, he asked me kind of where I fall ideologically, and I think the best two-word answer to that is constitutional conservative. And to briefly go into what that means to me, it means I believe we should be governed by documents, not people. People tend to be susceptible to corruption and personal interests above the good of society. And so today what I wanted to talk about was gerrymandering. This is an issue that's very much within the public sphere right now. There's been a Supreme Court case for which oral arguments were recently heard called Whitford v. Gill, and it has to do with partisan gerrymandering, which is unusual because typically the cases the court has taken up have been cases of racial gerrymandering.
Yeah.
But this one's a little bit different, and in it the plaintiffs argue that there should be a new test that should be used at the Supreme Court level in order to determine whether gerrymandering is unfairly partisan, because that's always been the discussion here is partisan gerrymandering is legal, but how partisan can it be without it venturing into being illegal? And so they detail something called the efficiency test. And the idea behind it, and forgive me because it's going to be a little bit of mathematics on an audio podcast, so that's a little tricky to explain, but essentially, if you have an archetypical election in a congressional district and let's say the Democrat wins with 60% of the vote and the Republican has 40% of the vote. The way the efficiency test works is it measures what are called wasted votes. So a wasted vote would be, first of all the votes of the losing candidates. So that's 800,000 in a typical congressional district. Let's say 40%, that's 300,000. And also every vote over 50% plus one that the Democrat would win, or the winner. And so those are called wasted votes. And so the idea is, in a given state, you add up all the wasted votes of the Democrats and the Republicans, and if there's a major discrepancy, typically above 7%, that is 7% of the electorate's votes are wasted, that is considered an unfair partisan gerrymander. Now, this is something that the plaintiffs have brought, not the court has decided. And this is what the court has always said, that they acknowledge that it is likely that extreme partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, but they need a test. That's how it works in litigatory circles, is you need some sort of test in order to determine if something is illegal. And I just wanted to talk about it today because I think the conversation about gerrymandering often talks about kind of superficial aspects of it, where we really need to get down to the philosophical roots of what groups you want represented in an electorate and what groups are important to preserve. This is one issue where you'll see the NAACP and the GOP on the exact same side of cases because they have similar interests when it comes to the type of districts they want to have. And so I wanted to open it up from there.
All right, so this is the case with the Wisconsin GOP, is it not, or is it another state?
Yes, it's the Wisconsin GOP,
Okay.
and this is precipitated by a state legislature election in which the GOP won, I think, about 48% of the vote and achieved about 61% of the districts.
And that other 52% split between Democrats and third-party candidates?
It was state legislature, so it was mainly just the Democrats. So it was very much, standard binary election. And for the purposes of the conversation, 52-48 seems about right.
Yeah, so a bit skewed then you would say for the results of that state, of those legislative seats. Yeah. So I guess my first talking point / question would be that if this case is decided in the way of the Wisconsin Democrats, I think that's the plaintiffs, right? Then what changes? What's going to happen?
So essentially, what would happen is you'd have a wave of litigation like hasn't been seen in a very long time in the United States. I was actually talking to a con law professor that I have, and he mentioned that if the court were to decide that partisan gerrymandering can be measured by this test, you'd have a wave of litigation like happened with Brown v. Board of Education, where it'd just be hundreds and hundreds of cases, and it would put a lot of strain on the court. So it would definitely be a landslide case in the history of the court if they were to rule in favor of the Wisconsin Democrats in this case. But there are some externalities here that need to be accounted for. Using the efficiency test, New York is considered a Republican gerrymander. Illinois, under some metrics, can be considered a Republican gerrymander.
As in, Republicans are in control, or they're being gerrymandered out.
No, it can
They
be
get
considered a
disproportionately
gerrymander that helps the Republicans in the efficiency test model, because there's more wasted quote-unquote Democrat votes than there are Republican votes.
So then the New York, I know that the state Senate in New York is tied or leans Republican. I think it's +1, but the House is pretty firmly Democrat, I think. So that would mean that if those lines would have to be redrawn to fit that efficiency test, then the state Senate would probably flip to the Democrats, and Illinois be kind of the same thing, more Democratic advantage. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and in our kind of layman's conception of it, New York doesn't seem like a state where a Republican gerrymander would occur, but that's the thing with any of these tests, is that none of them are always a perfect representation of reality, and you need to have a mathematical basis in order to approach this, in order for the court to be okay with it. And so, New York being a Republican gerrymander is, something that almost shocks the conscience to think that would be the case.
Yeah.
But it does work out that way because, again, there are aspects of drawing districts that result in certain realities where you have urban centers of population that it's very difficult to draw districts that protect communities of interest, which is a term that's used in the conversation about gerrymandering,
Right.
while also being geographically compact, contiguous, and all the other metrics that we consider important.
So you were wanting to get kind of into like the moral aspect of it. So aside from this case, just looking at gerrymandering in general, you were saying that you don't trust people because they have ulterior motives. They are swayed by different things, variables, votes, things like that. So in that case, do you support something like a nonpartisan commission to focus on gerrymandering and to redraw these districts if something like a victory for the plaintiff in this case would happen? Or how would you see those districts being redrawn? Like, who would do that?
What about a computer program, actually?
Yeah, and so that's
that's what these people would use. They'd use an algorithm to draw them.
And that's the two different models that are considered, right? Some sort of committee that is extra to the state legislature, or a computer model that can somehow determine these districts. And I think that there's problems with both. So when it comes to the committees, there's two approaches, nonpartisan and bipartisan. So bipartisan committees, you appoint equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans, and the idea is that they keep each other in check. What you typically see with these committees is that they then exist to protect incumbents, because Republicans and Democrats can't agree on who should get more party-wise, but they all agree our good old buddies should stay in power.
Yeah, it's also hard to, understand from like a proportional basis. Like, can you imagine, like, is it quite fair for like in Idaho, like Idaho Democrats having like such a large seat at the table? Obviously, it's there to ensure fairness, but like Idaho Democrats are like 4 out of 30 state Senate seats. You know what I mean? Like, so having an equal number of Democrats or Republicans there, and the same thing in like states like Hawaii or California.
Yeah.
So like it can lead to just kind of like Republicans having quote unquote too much power, or Democrats having too much power. So like then you move to like the nonpartisan one. So what's the issue there?
Well, so the issue with the nonpartisan ones is they're usually constructed of, the issue comes into who makes up this nonpartisan panel. And you have people with election experts and, those type of groups, but then we get into the real crux of the matter, which is the philosophical underpinnings of how to draw congressional districts, or how to draw single-member, single-representation districts in general, as contrasted with systems you see in other countries like Germany, like Britain, that have what are called proportional representation, where the idea is that, I'll just detail this in a sentence. In Germany, for instance, you fill out 2 ballots. One is for the individual in your district that you want to vote for, and you also vote for a party. And the idea is that once the election finishes, you see the total number of candidates that were emerged, and so let's say 60% of one party, 30% of one, and 10% of another. And then you see the secondary vote people cast for the parties. And you make it so that the Bundestag, which is the legislative body in Germany, matches the party composition. So they actually add seats until that composition matches. And that's a mixed system. Or you have systems in a lot of European countries where parties keep a list of candidates, and people in each district vote for a candidate, and you just fill out the legislature with the top 60 people on the list. They're people who represent the party line, and that's the idea. We're unique in the United States, so we let whoever wants to run under the banner of a party. It's kind of the reason people got pissed off at Bernie Sanders, right? Is he was never a Democrat, but was able to run under the Democrat banner, demand Democrat resources, et cetera, et cetera. And so with these nonpartisan committees, you need to decide what it is that matters to you as far as the congressional districts and what metrics and which they're drawn, because one thing the court's been very clear on is that they aren't going to use proportional representation of parties as a metric for that, because there isn't a constitutional argument you can make for, okay, if there's 50% Democrats in the state and 50% Republicans, then the state should have 50% congressional delegations, or 60-40, or somewhere within that ballpark. That hasn't been a compelling argument to the court in the past, and it's not the spirit of the electoral system that we've established.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you there. Like, it's not fair because, like, people stay registered as Democrat for years, even after they've switched to Republicans, and vice versa, or, like, they become independents, and that also, like, disenfranchises independents, people that are politically leaning. Like, that's not the right way to go about it. Also doesn't take into account how quickly people change their minds, for better or for worse. But like, it's just not like a very democratic
I think
system.
also it defeats the point of what a representative democracy is supposed to mean. It's you hold people accountable through elections, so
Right.
people do not do things that they know you're not going to like because they want your vote again. If they automatically just get representation of an equal amount, then they're not going to put forward programs that they know are going to be popular with the American people.
And that's the reason why sometimes you have weak legislatures in countries that have these party rosters through which the legislators are determined, because they aren't accountable to a specific set of people. And that's why using partisan metrics here is so tricky, because in order to establish these partisan metrics, one has to assume you'd have to create safely Democratic or safely Republican seats, which then protects those parties' influence in the area. Whereas, suppose there was a wave election like in 2010 for the Republicans, the central idea behind partisanly gerrymandered districts in order to proportionally represent the people in a state is the idea that the parties aren't in flux. And you look at states like West Virginia, or states like, even right now, your blue wall, Wisconsin, Michigan, all these states, they're currently having a partisan flux. And as the party's identity changes, as the Democrat Party decides what direction it wants to go, as the Republican Party hopefully turns away from Donald Trump, I can hope.
Yeah.
That's going to be something that is constantly in flux, and our system isn't reactive enough to be able to adjust to micro changes in partisanship, so we need to look at something else. And that's been kind of the tradition of how to draw these districts, is you look to protect so-called communities of interest.
Right.
But then what are those communities of interest?
Right, they can be communities of color, people of a certain socioeconomic class, like your quote unquote like your wealthy suburbs, or like your inner cities, big huge tracts of farmland, that kind of thing. How do you define that without it getting like racially motivated? And like, fact of the matter is, like, African Americans, Hispanics, like they overwhelmingly, or like they disproportionately vote Democrat. Affluent white people in like certain communities, like they vote Republican. Like, how do you do that without you have a community of interest, but like when they're voting not as a block but more as a block than you'd want? Like, how do you prevent that from just getting into like gerrymandering territory where Democrats isolate inner city communities, urban white liberals, that kind of thing, to like consolidate power?
It's always seemed to me that at least the two most important variables to focus on drawing districts going forward would be geography and obviously population. We do need to keep equal population sizes within congressional districts, but kind of putting that as much as possible into lines of geography, right? Not drawing these insanely crazy looking districts for the sake of, we want all these people kept together. Because I think in certain ways you're right, we have to preserve communities and interests that those communities have, but I think just the idea of doing that leads to gerrymandering, because like you said, Saurabh, people have motivations, right? They want that community to have that voting power because they know that that's what's going to get them into office.
Right.
Because that community is going to support them.
And here's the thing with geography, though. It seems, and that's the thing with the coverage of gerrymandering, is it's very easy to point to a district that's shaped funnily and say, ha ha, look at the gerrymander. But that's not always as simple. And you look at certain specific districts, like there's one that's actually very famous and it gets floated around in a lot of media, is one that's shaped like earmuffs, and it's two large areas that are connected by actually one strip of road.
Right.
I think John Oliver covers it in his segment on gerrymandering.
Right.
And he details this, but that's actually considered a favorite district by people who study these type of things, because what it does is it protects a Hispanic community that is contained within that oddly shaped district,
Right.
and the space in between was actually an African American community that also has a representative that matches their interest. And so the problem is that the easiest way to point to a district and say that it's gerrymandered is geography, but that's often the least important aspect of maintaining communities of interest. And so we have a conflict here between the easiest way to instinctually think that a district is gerrymandered versus the way that it actually should be constructed, which is the idea of protecting those communities of interest, if that is what you decide is the most important metric. And you do see, ways that this is messed around with, like Chicago, for instance. Because of the way that urban centers of population concentrate, what they've had to do is they've had to do these spokes that go up from the center of the city, and so they capture inner city, downtown, and then it goes into the suburbs. And so then you have a community that isn't any specific community of interest, but because of geography and having to maintain that population amount, those districts are constructed the way they are.
Yeah, like Texas is at the center of this gerrymandering debate also, like I think in a separate case, which may be like on the racial side
Yes.
as opposed to the mathematics side. So like my district, back home, it's like all of the entirety of Laredo, a lot of the valley, and like part of San Antonio, and like you see there that like it's mainly connected by I-35, and like that I used to be able to point to, like until like you mentioned this, like I started realizing like I would point at that district and say it's kind of bizarre looking, but like these are heavily Hispanic areas, and they're represented by a Hispanic congressman that, while I don't personally love him very much, and he's a little bit moderate for my taste, like he does represent, I can confidently say he represents the views of like most of my peers, like people around me, adults. So like we have to, by what you're saying, like we do have to look at the shapes and look at like saying like, well, this district has a lot of people of color, has a lot of, white affluent people, whatever you want really, and like just make sure those communities of interest are protected. But at the same time, like you get into a question of like what defines a community of interest? That's the question you were asking. Like, and it's not easy to define that. Is it by race, socioeconomic status?
And I want to say on that, do we want representatives that are running in a democracy to represent a black district or to represent a Hispanic district?
Right.
Like, I get the fact that, that we have to keep those communities together and preserve interests. But there becomes a point where we have, a democratic system that focuses on saying, like, you're only going to represent people who are going to vote Democratic.
Right.
You're only going to represent people who are going to vote Republican. We get mad at Ted Cruz all the time for coming to Austin and saying, well, the People's Republic of Texas, and then there's the People's Republic of Austin. Like, if we want a representative that's going to represent our interest as well, then we should have congressional systems that focus on that, right? I think, you're mentioning the earmuff thing. Hispanics and blacks, obviously, they have kind of different interests on certain issues just because of culture and things like that, stereotypically. But there are also a lot of issues, I think, where they, suffering from income inequality, that even poor whites feel. And I think that if we had districts that focused more on geography, focused more on representing diverse groups of people, you would have representatives that come from that system that represent diverse interests.
Yeah.
Rather than just saying like, oh, this is always going to be held by someone who's a liberal, or this is always going to be held by someone.
Right, this is the black candidate, this is the Hispanic candidate. They're going to focus on these token issues. Which
And
are
on the
important,
electoral
but
side of that, we need someone who's going to run on a platform that says, I'm listening to all of you, I'm representing interests of all of you, rather than just saying, well, I only have to cater to these groups of people, or I only have to worry about this. Because then we end up just having, people like poor whites or like Hispanics, like other minority groups, that just feel like they're never being focused on other than the people who look like them in Congress.
It really takes the competition out of politics, and to have real innovation and development, you have to have that competition. Like, politics is like a business in that way. And, the Republican Party and the Democratic...
there.
No, like, these are essentially developed industries that keep on feeding young talent into them, they rise up, etc.
Yeah, I keep getting told, the rising stars in the Republican Party, Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio, all these people.
yeah, we're not fans.
Yeah, but that's the interesting thing, right? Is that what's characteristic of the United States system of politics is we're a country that's characterized by intersecting social cleavages, and social cleavages are basically. I'm getting into wonky political science terms. I'll actually forward
No, feel free.
I'll forward this to my political science professor later, and he'll be happy with me. But
as long as he shares on Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. but we're characterized by intersecting social cleavages. So race is one of them, gender is one of them, income is one of them. Yeah. But then you look at, especially at the state legislative level, where you have really nuclear interests. So urban versus rural. Close to a river, far away from a river. There's an old joke in the Texas legislature that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. And you see that some of the ugliest fights over legislation in state legislatures are often over things like water rights or agricultural rights and, civil assets and, border communities versus communities farther away from the border. What rights should they have? And there's so many intersecting social cleavages within American politics that what's characteristic of the United States system is that no single one is dominant. People don't tend to vote with any single social cleavage universally enough for people to be able to point to it and say, Americans vote based on blank.
Right.
They don't. And you can make that argument by saying that, the Democratic Party bills itself as the party of the poor, and poor whites don't vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. And so we are a country of intersecting social cleavages. And so that's the trickiest thing with these nonpartisan committees that people have proposed, is that the exercise that you have to undertake before you create them is, what are the metrics by which they should measure a successfully represented
So
district?
how would you kind of, explain that in relations to age, in relations to race? Because we see millennials overwhelmingly vote for Democrats. We see that minorities overwhelmingly vote for Democrats. So how do you kind of, compare that to what you just said about there's no large scale block that's just voting for one party.
And that's the interesting thing, right? Is that we have to contend with holdovers from the civil rights era that were designed in order to protect the representative rights of minorities. There's still a lot of court precedent in place that protects the existence of majority minority districts, which are districts that have a majority of people being a minority group, African Americans, Hispanics, etc. Right. And we have to contend with that precedent. And I still think that there are areas in which that is necessary, because if you have a state that has an overwhelmingly white population, but there is a center of African Americans or Hispanics, I think there's a reasonable argument to be made that when it comes to interest representation, that may be one social cleavage that you want properly represented. At the very least, for kind of basic psychological reasons, people have an innate sense that the people who represent them should look like them. But I think that there are other social cleavages that should be taken into account, and the problem we see is it's starting to get very difficult to distinguish between a racial gerrymander and a partisan gerrymander, because African Americans
they're so intricately intertwined. I want to
Or rural whites with Republicans.
I want to wind it back a little bit to a point you made earlier, saying about overwhelmingly white states with minority centers. The first state that comes to mind, or states like your Mississippi and Alabama's, right? Like, they have overwhelmingly white, but there are centers of, especially like African American, areas, that's what you call like the Black Belt, right? And like those places, those people, all they have really are like their mayors, right? They overwhelmingly vote for Democratic mayors, usually of color, and like in the state ledge, like they have like maybe 2 or 3 representatives maximum, and that's it. And their governors and the other state legislatures, like they roll over their interests and like they steamroll ahead with like very socially conservative policies that like are not going to benefit them, economically conservative policies that are not going to benefit them. You may disagree with that, of course, but that's not their interest, and that's clearly not what they want, because they're voting for Democratic mayors. And then like if you look down at the district level, they want Democratic senators and Democratic governors, but they're not getting them. Obviously, we don't roll over for a minority, and I mean like a minority in a percentage way, right? If the vote only ends up being 20%, we're not going to roll over for that. But what is the solution if like the vote ends up being 20%, but like the state legislature isn't even 20% Democratic? Then what's the solution there?
Well, I think one reality that we have to contend with when thinking about this is people more so than ever tend to congregate in areas that believe the same way they do. And this is kind of the fool's errand of trying to create districts in general, is that let's say you have a map laid out, but people are mainly moving into one specific district. Well, it's not as if you can slightly modify the current map you have. You need to almost redraw the whole thing, because the changes radiate outwards, and almost every district has to end up looking differently based on the new population. And we only do this every 10 years, but frankly, the level of population movement in the country probably it needs to be adjusted for, and doing that more often, but censuses happen every 10 years, and so that's the rate we do it at. I think the tricky aspect of this is we need to, there's a moral question in that, do we consider it bad if there are 20% Democrats in a state, but let's say 2 out of the 16 congressional delegation members are Democrats, for instance?
So what I would say to that, and this is something that I went to a political convention this past summer, and the first class I went to was talking about voting rights and the idea of like multi-member districts and stuff like that. And something that the guy brought up was, it's not the idea that in the legislature right now you have 2 out of the 16 as opposed to 20%. It's the idea of whether or not that 20% population has the possibility of electing people who represent their interests, which I think is the caveat here. It's not that, like, let's say the Republicans have, a sweeping majority because of, midterms, and they take back a bunch of state legislators. That's fine. That's politics. But it's the idea, can those liberal-leaning people in any way, shape, or form possibly gain equal representation, which I think is the caveat here, and why I'm so against the idea of gerrymandering, because that's completely what it fights against, is the idea that it gives people no chance whatsoever to ever even gain close to equal representation.
And so that's the thing, right? So there's two types of gerrymandering. There's two terms, cracking and packing, which I find endlessly amusing. But cracking, for instance, is breaking up minorities or any group really into a bunch of different districts in order to dilute their voting potential, or putting them all into or putting them all into one district in order to cement the benefits of single districts in order to make them less competitive or beneficial to incumbents. There's a couple different reasons it can be done. And so, based off of what you said, it sounds like your conception of a moral system of districts would be where communities of interest are packed into districts where they are capable of electing a member that represents them. And that is definitely one approach to take about it. And I think it's the approach that I lean more towards, because no matter what those interests are, we have to contend with the different intersecting social cleavages. And so there's a couple of examples that can be made. So when it comes to an inner city type situation where you have historically poor communities that tend to be minorities, I think that there is something to be said for having congresspeople elected in a way based off districts that are drawn in order to preserve those interests. However, when you move out to, say, a rural area, I think that there, here's an example. There's a military base in that area. There needs to be one congressman representing that military base, otherwise you're going to have a fracturing of that voting potential. And you see this in Congress, actually. You see Congress people who have a very specific group that they're trying to protect and that they rely on to vote for them, and they vote in order to do that. When budgets come up, they add budget riders in order to benefit those communities. Mm-hmm. So for instance, if it's a poor mining town, they'll advocate for an increased level of investment from the federal government or decreased coal regulations, et cetera, et cetera. I think that using one metric across the board for what constitutes fair representation is a folly, because, as I said earlier, in this country we have intersecting social cleavages. And this is a conversation that always needs to be happening, because the fundamental problem is that people are always moving around. People move from one state to another.
Consolidating in certain states.
Exactly. There was some video I saw in preparation for this where the guy tries to straw man the liberal behavior in the situation. He says liberals tend to congregate in these dens of communism that they create in the middle of inner cities.
Did you watch this video on Prager University's YouTube channel?
Yeah, well, I like Dennis Prager a lot.
I'm sorry. All right, let's go ahead and start the wrap up here. Let's go with final thoughts across the board, starting with Saurabh.
Sure. So I think that my main goal when bringing up this topic was to inspire conversation. I think that gerrymandering is one of those conversations that the way it becomes salacious has almost nothing to do with whether or not it's an issue. I.e., oh look, it's a funny shaped district. Mm-hmm. It's shaped like a salamander, which is interestingly what gerrymander comes from.
Right.
And so the conversation needs to be deconstructed a little bit, where we need to talk about what are the groups that we believe should be represented above all else. And that's not the conversation that's happening these days. And when I first started elucidating this to friends of mine, they really started to think, because that's not the conversation we have. And geographical compactness almost seems like the least important thing in this situation. Yeah. There's obvious reasons why you want districts to be contiguous, but honestly, I'm in favor of a district shaped like a salamander if it actually preserves the interest of the community. And I think that this also, dovetails into another conversation we need to have as Americans, where we've started to think more and more along racial lines, where that is going to damage our democracy more than anything else, because there are groups like, Hispanics, they vote for Democrats, but they don't vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. It's, 60-40 is the last time I saw? It's something like that. And even Hispanics, we look at that as a monolith, but Cuban Americans vote drastically more for Republicans compared to other groups. And so being less focused on race while also considering it an important factor, and then identifying what are the interests that Americans vote on, is much more a productive conversation than what we've been having until now, where it's, haha, look at the funny shaped district. And I think as the Supreme Court precedent rolls out, it's going to be a big change in this country, because we're finally going to have to contend with the idea that, at least in the current status quo, politicians are always going to be looking to preserve their own interests. That's what politicians do. But as informed voters, we can vote for candidates who believe in representing different constituencies, while not trying to advance one constituency's interests over another and trying to balance them.
Okay, I think it's a good place to end it. So Rob, thank you so much for coming out to the show.
Thank you.
I think it was a very interesting discussion, probably the best one we've had so far in the pod.
Well, that's
Yeah.
all I need then.
Yeah.
Put that on my Facebook timeline.
Yeah,
Best discussion
absolutely.
on a lefty podcast.
All right, so thanks for listening. Be sure to come back and listen next week. We'll have another guest star, probably talk about something else. Okay, thanks for listening.
Thank you.